Back then, he certainly did not see it as a medicine.
I could only see from my ivory tower that lots of people were using marijuana. I had a concern that marijuana was a I believed it, a terribly dangerous drug.
And why wouldn't he? The 1930s era film Reefer Madness was a dramatic manifestation of government and media claims about the dangers of marijuana. The film portrays marijuana smokers as delirious, insane, even homicidal. Dr. Grinspoon was gravely concerned, and he wanted to give young students the proof that marijuana was hurting them.
I went into the library and started to look at this. I wanted to provide a scientific and medical basis for the prohibition. What was the government standing on and saying that this was a dangerous drug?
Psychotic reactions can happen. Marijuana is now known to initiate depressive episodes, delusional episodes, manic episodes, and even psychotic episodes.
Dr. Eric Voth is an internal medicine physician and an addiction and pain specialist in Topeka, Kansas. He's also the chairman of the Institute on Global Drug Policy and has advised former presidents Reagan, Bush Sr., Bush Jr., and Clinton on drug policy. A critic of medical marijuana, he says one of his biggest concerns is the risk of mental illness, especially schizophrenia.
There are clearly patients where it kind of uncaps the psychosis. Schizophrenia is a form of a psychotic illness, and uncapping it in people who didn't know they had it, there have been episodes, again, of people who have sort of uncapped and continued schizophrenic that did not have it ahead of time.
Indeed, research has shown a connection between marijuana use and schizophrenia. There is also great concern over marijuana use in teens and young adults because their brains are still developing. But it's still unclear whether marijuana causes mental illness or someone with a mental illness is more likely to use marijuana. As a psychiatrist, Dr. Grinspoon's expertise was in schizophrenia, and he strongly disagrees with critics who say marijuana may trigger the disease.
I think that is absurd. If you just take the fact that schizophrenia, the frequency of schizophrenia is about 1% the world around. Now, you would expect with a drug that's used as often as it is, you would expect that there'd be a little bleep in this. It doesn't change a bit. It hasn't changed. In fact, you can find as much literature about how cannabis is useful to schizophrenic patients as it's harmful.
Dr. Grinspoon could not find evidence to back up the government and media reports that marijuana use leads to drug-induced violence, and incurable insanity.
He is hopelessly and incurably insane, a condition caused by the drug marijuana to which he was addicted.
This substance, the most harmful thing about it was not any inherent psychopharmacological property of the drug, but rather the way we as a society were treating the people who use this drug.
It's been a medicine for about 3,000 years now. It only hasn't been a medicine in this country for 68 years. I say in the scheme of things, it's been a medicine a whole lot longer than it hasn't been.
Dr. Donald Abrams is a professor of clinical medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and an oncology physician at San Francisco General Hospital. He says doctors were able to freely prescribe cannabis for various ailments up until 1937.
Harry Anslinger, who was a prohibitionist and the first head of the Federal Narcotics Bureau, decided to introduce the so-called Marijuana Tax Act. Physicians in the United States knew the medicine as cannabis, and by using marijuana, he sort of did an end run around the medical community.
The act imposed a high tax on medical marijuana and such onerous registration and reporting requirements that it effectively banned its use as a medicine altogether. The American Medical Association came out in opposition to the act, with Dr. William C. Woodward testifying there was no evidence the medical use of cannabis was causing addiction, and that there are evident potentialities in the drug that should not be shut off by adverse legislation. He opined that it's impossible to foresee how much the new regulations will deprive the public of the benefits of a drug that, on further research, may prove to be of substantial value. The Marijuana Tax Act delivered the final blow to a medicine that was already being replaced by the opiates and aspirin. Cannabis was removed from the U.S. Pharmacopoeia in 1942. The fact that cannabis was an accepted, valuable medicine in the United States for nearly a century might be surprising to the teens who grew up watching the dramatizations of reefer madness. It certainly came as a surprise to Dr. Grinspoon.
I discovered when I got into the library that I, despite my training in science and medicine, had been brainwashed.
He put his findings into an 80-page paper, aptly titled Marijuana Reconsidered. It was later published in Scientific American. Then his professional investigation of cannabis took an unexpected, personal turn. His son Danny, suffering from childhood leukemia, had begun chemotherapy.
The chemotherapeutics that he had to receive were just devastating to him in terms of the nausea and vomiting. It's a nausea that goes right down to your toenails. I mean, it's really beyond description.
Even with all his prior research, Dr. Grinspoon still had no idea that marijuana might be able to stop Danny's chemotherapy-induced nausea. One night at a dinner party, an oncology doctor who had read his paper on marijuana related the story of a 17-year-old with leukemia who used marijuana to treat his terrible nausea.
On the way home from there in the car, my wife, Betsy, asked me, don't you think we ought to get a little bit of marijuana for Danny the next time he gets... And I said, I'm almost ashamed to say this. I said, no, that would be breaking the law. And I don't want to offend the physicians, who are taking care of him. So I was against it. She's a rather plucky woman, and next time he came in for his chemotherapy, she went up to the Wellesley High School parking lot, and they found his friend Mark, and asked him if Mrs. Grinspoon wanted a little bit of marijuana.
When Dr. Grinspoon showed up for Danny's chemo treatment, he was surprised to find his wife and Danny so relaxed.
They were joking, and he was smiling, and no problem. He got on the gurney, had the injection, and whereas before, with this particular chemo, he became nauseous, felt awful right away, and the race to get home before he started to vomit, and then in a bed with a bucket at his side there until it was just dry heaves. That day, he got off the gurney. He said, "Hey, Mom, there's a sub sandwich on Brookline Avenue, I noticed. Could we get a sub on the way home?"
When he discovered Danny had smoked marijuana, Dr. Grinspoon was not angry. He was relieved.
And I called the doctor, the attending who was taking care of him, and I said, I'm not going to stand in his way doing this again. He said, don't. And don't have him do it in the parking lot. I want to see this myself. And so it went. He never had any difficulty with nausea and vomiting. With the further treatments for as long as he lived, he was free of that anxiety. And I can tell you, it was not only a relief for him, it was a relief for his parents and his siblings. It was a godsend.
Not surprisingly, Dr. Grinspoon has become an ardent supporter of legalizing marijuana for medical use.
People who suffer from these symptoms and syndromes, depending on just how serious they are, that's always accompanied by anxiety. And to take and artificially impose another level of anxiety, the anxiety involved in doing something which is illegal, for which you can be punished, is cruel.
By the 1980s, scientific interest in cannabis had begun to catch up with the personal experiences. According to a 1982 United States Institute of Medicine report, Marijuana and Health, the preliminary research coupled with anecdotal evidence warranted a closer look at medicinal cannabis. The report also found that marijuana attacks diseases and symptoms differently than other drugs. This offered the tantalizing possibility for drug companies to develop new, novel drugs out of the chemicals in the marijuana plant. The Institute of Medicine called for more research on these chemicals, known as cannabinoids. Even with this encouragement, research on cannabis failed to flower.
There aren't many scientists or clinical investigators who are particularly interested in doing research in medical marijuana because it's such a hassle.
Marijuana's Schedule I status means Dr. Abrams has to get approval from more than a half dozen regulatory bodies before he can start a cannabis medical trial.
There are so many roadblocks that you have to go through.
Marijuana is an illegal substance that I think a lot of investigators and even organizations just don't want to get involved in something that is so controversial.
Dr. Igor Grant is a professor of psychiatry and the director of the California-based Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research. He says not only is the research bureaucratically difficult, it's expensive, and financial backers are hard to find.
You know, an ordinary investigator just does not have the time or resources to do this kind of work. I mean, you really need, either federal or state funding or pharma funding, something to navigate this whole system.
The center's research was funded by a $9 million grant from California taxpayers. The money allowed for a few legitimate small marijuana trials, including several done by Dr. Abrams, that confirmed what Rosenfeld was saying all along, that cannabis works on pain, especially pain that does not respond to opiates.
All of them, to some extent or another, demonstrated that smoked marijuana is effective in this situation for which we really don't have very good treatments.
I can say that the cannabinoids are almost certain to be useful in neuropathic pain based on the research that we've done.
But even when researchers get significant results like this, Dr. Abrams says cannabis research can still be an academic dead end.
When I submit it for publication, I have found what I perceive to be a publication bias, that people are not particularly interested in publishing data suggesting that marijuana might have some benefits. All of those things, I think, sort of dampen anybody's enthusiasm to take on medical marijuana research.
And scientists are not getting much help from pharmaceutical companies either.
No pharmaceutical company is interested in supporting, marijuana research.
Because it's a naturally occurring substance out in the world, so you can't patent it per se. So the research on it is quite dicey. It really is. Nobody can make any money on that research or on that development.
Even if drug companies created a novel marijuana plant drug that they could patent, doctors could not prescribe it.
It's going to be a class 1 type of drug, that's not going to be broadly used. And again, why do you want to spend a lot of time developing a drug that you can't really sell?
Why would a pharmaceutical company want to get involved with something like that? I think until marijuana is rescheduled, large-scale research will probably not occur.
Advocates have been mired in a decades-long legal fight with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency to do just that. In the late 80s, they made the argument that marijuana has accepted medical value and that it belongs on Schedule II.
It was almost